It looks as though we are live on YouTube. Magnificent. Awesome. All right. Started streaming.
It looks as though we are live on YouTube.
Thank goodness. All right. Probably by 2:02, I'm going to go ahead and get started, guys. Okay. Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining today's event. My name is Alexia Jordan. I am the Innovation, Cyber, and National Security Analyst for the Lincoln Network. Our webinar today is about two sister bills that were signed into law 3 years ago. The Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, aka SESTA, and the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, which is FOSTA. These two names obviously sound like things that people can't possibly have a problem with, reject, but the relationship between these bills and the very severe and serious problem of sex trafficking that we're trying to stop are very much so correlated with our ideas of the internet and what free speech is. So today, I have the honor, the privilege, all the good adjectives in the world for speaking with these three phenomenal professionals who have done just great work in the sex trafficking, human trafficking space, as well as internet law, free speech, privacy law. So I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. We'll go in order, and then we'll go ahead and talk a little bit about, we're going to start with just this broad framing of like, what is the relationship between the internet and human trafficking? Because they sound kind of disparate, but they're not. So Danielle, if you could please start by introducing yourself, just giving us a little bit of your background.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Danielle Borelli. I'm the operations coordinator for the California Cybersecurity Institute. I'm also the program coordinator for the Trafficking Investigations Hub of the CCI. At the CCI, we really focus on reskilling, upskilling, and providing certifications for the California workforce, as well as education and awareness around issues involving cybersecurity. And then, of course, our Tech for Good arm, which falls under the Trafficking Investigations Hub. And at the hub, we really focus on, discovering and identifying different technical revenues and ways to help identify where human trafficking is occurring, but also trying to help assess to what extent it really is happening on certain websites and with certain technologies. And then, of course, we also do training with law enforcement and other service providers. But really, my background, I've been involved in anti-human trafficking work for about 10 years, a lot of it on the service provision side. So a lot of it working with law enforcement, but more so working with survivors and getting to see, the impacts of certain these laws and kind of the carceral effects that they've had negatively, of course, more so than anything else. And so we'll hopefully be able to lean a little more into that background to discuss that today, and looking forward to it. So.
Awesome, thank you. Next, Emma, could you please give us a little second about yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about the panel today. My name is Emma Lonzo. I'm the director of the Free Expression Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I head up CDT's work on all things free expression online. So that includes intermediary liability laws like Section 230 in the United States, or the E-commerce Directive and Digital Services Act in the European Union, looking at fundamental rights protection for speech online. What does the First Amendment guarantee as far as the limits on how Congress can regulate our ability to speak or regulate intermediaries to be policemen for our speech? I also do a lot of work on content moderation and transparency reporting directly with technology companies, looking at how their content policies, the way they enforce them, and what they tell users or the outside world about those policies really ends up shaping and affecting the access to information and opportunities to speak for so many different kinds of people across the country and around the world. We were very involved in the legislative advocacy around SESTA-FOSTA. CDT was ultimately opposed to SESTA and FOSTA and to the kind of Frankenstein hybrid of the two bills together, and worked with groups like the Electronic Frontiers Foundation and a variety of sex worker rights organizations in trying to educate Congress and advocate against the bill. CDT also joined as an amicus in the EFF and Woodhull Foundation and Human Rights Watch First Amendment challenge to SESTA-FOSTA after it was passed into law. And that case is still pending before the courts.
Thank you for that introduction, Emma. And I'm loving how you guys see, this is why you have to let people give their own introductions, because you guys say things that I would not have said coming out of your bios. I love it. Alexandra, could you please top us off?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm Alex Gelderman. I am a visiting assistant professor of law at Notre Dame Law School, where I teach currently a course on the regulation of social media. My background is in human trafficking work. I spent a decade as an attorney at the Human Trafficking Legal Center, where I serve as of counsel now. My work really lies at the intersection of human trafficking and internet law, specifically around intermediary liability and content moderation, and as I mentioned, the regulation of social media. So I was also really involved in the challenge to FOSTA and SESTA a couple of years ago, and have worked with a broad coalition of people. As Emma mentioned, there's quite a lot of different interest groups who are involved in this, and I also had the opportunity to work with them as this bill was being shaped, ultimately passed, and challenged.
Okay, thank you, ladies. Thank you so much. So I'm going to start high level, as I mentioned, because this topic strikes at the heart of people's fundamental feelings about the correlation between internet and freedom. So first, the relationship between internet and human trafficking, just to get us started. Everyone has access to the internet. Everyone does everything on the internet. We buy shoes, we buy clothes. I, tried on these Warby Parker glasses. We do everything on the internet. And that's no different for criminals and people who are looking to engage in illicit or actually legal behavior. So what we found, with the proliferation of the internet and with several large cases that came, to the public's attention about certain websites, we can start with Backpage, for example, is that human trafficking, sex trafficking, and the trafficking specifically of minors was just skyrocketing through the roof. And people's want to continue their ad revenues, continue the traffic to their website, gave them plausibility to turn a blind eye to the illicit behavior that was happening on their websites. So there was a push for these two sister bills, the SESTA and the FOSTA. One came from the House and one came from the Senate. So with this proliferation of the internet, we had this increase in sex trafficking, and now we have this group of people that say, hey, internet, this is bad, and we need to stop this immediately. And so I'd like to hear So that is just, kind of the broadness of why we're here, the relationship between the internet and human trafficking. But this kind of gets into the nitty gritty about the bills and were they good, and what was their intent. So whoever would like to take this question first, please feel free. I would like to hear from all three of you all, because the three of you all are very seasoned professionals with varying opinions on this. So could you describe in your own words what you feel the intent of the FOSTA-SESTA law was, and versus its actual impact, and maybe just a couple of sentences, about 2 or 3 sentences. Danielle, do you want to start? Well, in the same order, Danielle, Emma, Alexandra.
Sure. So, and I wasn't directly involved in the development of it, nor was I involved in kind of the push against it. And I will say that overall, I would not for the bill and for the act itself. I think it has done a lot more harm than good. At face value, I think it was really political. For me, it kind of reminds me of a pork and barrel pill more than anything else, because it was really targeted towards one specific internet company or service provider. And through that, we've seen, of course, it got shut down. But really, when you look at the data behind it, it didn't really have the long-term effects it was hoping to have. If I remember correctly, DARPA's Mimics projects showed about 100,000 advertisements on a daily basis before the bill was passed. The day after, it was about 20,000, but 6 months later, it was back up to about the same amount, which shows that terminology that's used in advertisements can change, and so can the venue. And so really it didn't really do very much as far as protecting people. And then of course, I think the people that it affected the most were sex workers. And I'm sure that Alexandra and Emma will agree that it's disproportionately affected them far more than it helped victims of trafficking. And because it took their one of their main places of safety for not only community, but also for vetting their clientele, and either push them back into kind of a more archaic on the streets situation where they can't vet those potential clientele, and puts them at risk. And there's stories, and I'm sure Alexandra and Emma will share if they've had any experience with them, but there's been stories of sex workers who have now been raped, beaten, murdered because of FOSTA-SESTA. And so I think that as a bill itself, it's failed the people it's trying to serve, and it's caused a lot more harm than good. So loaded statements, I know, but
I mean, I couldn't have put it better myself. I think the orientation, a little bit more maybe background on SESTA FOSTA. So for a number of years, there had been various claims brought against different websites, and most kind of notoriously Backpage.com, by victims of trafficking, people who had been sold for sex against their will on Backpage.com, and they were trying to recover damages from the website directly, alleging that the website was responsible or culpable for what had happened to them, and that the website should pay up. And those cases, pretty much across the board, coming up through state court systems, were struck down, or the claimants weren't able to get the kind of recovery they were looking for, because Section 230 is a law that I think a lot more people are familiar with as a name these days than even just 3 years ago. Section 230, the law that sets out the general liability parameters for the hosts and other intermediaries who deal with third-party content, 230 says pretty clearly that those intermediaries are shielded from being treated as the publisher or speaker of third-party content. So to the extent that all of these different victims, their claims were really based on trying to say that it was because the website operator published this ad that had been used to traffic them, that was the source of liability for the website. 230 very clearly and consistently gave the answer that, as a matter of federal law, no, we don't hold website operators legally responsible for content that's authored by third parties. So SESTA FOSTA, in a lot of ways, was an attempt to change that, right? It was to say that's not the right balance, and we want these websites to be held accountable for this kind of content. I'm trying to give a neutral or even sort of positive framing of the bill, because I think you'll continue to hear a lot of criticism probably from all of us for most of this session. But one of the really key features of Section 230 that did not get nearly enough attention during the SESTA FOSTA debates is that 230, from the day it was passed in 1996, has included an exception for federal criminal law. federal criminal law has always applied to website operators, search engines, access providers, any of the intermediaries who might be involved. And in fact, it was existing federal criminal law that was what was used to take down the Backpage.com websites. It wasn't even SESTA FOSTA. There was, almost by DOJ's own tacit admission, no need to amend the existing framework to use federal criminal law to go after Backpage.com. Now, that case is actually still kind of tied up in court. It seems like a lot of procedural issues are going on with it, but the fact of the matter is, SESTA FOSTA was almost sort of an answer to a problem that actually had a solution on the table already. And so it raised a lot of concerns, but I'll stop there because I know you asked us to keep to a couple of sentences, and pass it over to Alex because I know she's got lots of thoughts about the bill as well.
Thank you. So first, to echo what both Danielle and Emma said, that's all very helpful background. I think to take a little bit, to take the 30,000-foot view, there is this perception that trafficking and sex trafficking is skyrocketing because of the internet. And we really don't, there's really no reason to believe that's true. What we do know is that it's more visible. It's more kind of visible to people who aren't looking for it necessarily. And I think that really what SESTA FOSTA and similar initiatives was a desire to attack what seemed to be the cause, but was actually just the thing that was making this visible, which was the internet. So I have argued that that's mistaken as a tactical approach. And Backpage was really at the heart of this from a sort of a narrative standpoint. Backpage had a lot of detractors because of its hosting, the fact that it was known to host a lot of sex work ads, and was alleged to host ads for trafficking victims as well. Much of the push involved Backpage, and then Backpage, as Emma mentioned, was indicted a couple of weeks before FOSTA was passed under existing laws, which we all knew it could be. There was nothing stopping that. It was not. There's no trafficking allegations in that case. So at that point, I think SESTA had a ton of momentum, and it was passed into law. But as I'm sure we'll get to this, but it's really been used almost not at all. And I would argue that really it was a response to Backpage. And once Backpage was taken down through other means, it kind of lost its verve, its energy in its specifics.
Alexandra, that's actually literally a perfect segue to my next question. Anyone can answer this? I might tug on you, Alexandra. So, all three of you all have mentioned we already had Section 230. We already had a federal exception against sex trafficking. So, that was kind of already there. It was already in law. So why did we need the second thing? What the FOSTA-SESTA law did provide was this access now to state AGs, state attorney generals, to be able to go after online hosts and charge them with liabilities if they saw fit. So now what we've done is kind of increase the prosecutorial landscape for this type of crime. And what I'd like to talk about a little bit more, and I'd like to hear from you all, is since this landscape has increased, we now have all these types of people that can bring cases against internet providers under the FOSTA-SESTA, kind of even more expanding Section 230 in this respect. Alexandra, you just mentioned it. Have people used it? Have we seen, has it been useful? So you guys say, no, maybe it hasn't been that harmful. It hasn't been that helpful to sex workers. We're going to get into that later, but I'd love to hear any stories that y'all have about its usage by AGs or other folks looking to address this.
Sorry, do you want to go ahead or do you want me to?
I'll go ahead and start and say I don't have any, because I do work with prosecutors occasionally, but I have never had a case where they've actually used FOSTA-SESTA before. So, but I'm sure being in your legal work, the two of you might have more stories than I do.
Oh, yeah, no, please go ahead, Alexandra.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so there were 3 expansions that FOSTA brought about. One was the exception to Section 230, two exceptions for civil litigants who wanted to bring trafficking cases in federal court against intermediaries. As you mentioned, state AGs. And then it also added a federal cause of action, 2421A, which adds a federal criminal liability for owning, managing, operating a website with the intent to facilitate the prostitution of another. And then there are various enhancements. So there's 3 potential ways this could be used. And really the answer to your question is it's barely been used at all. And granted, there's sealed indictments out there, and there's not a database of like one central database that's searchable that would give us all the information. So it's possible there's stuff out there that we don't know about. I know of no state cases brought by state AGs. I know of a couple of civil cases that have brought up FOSTA. FOSTA did not create a new cause of action in civil court. So it wouldn't really come up in a complaint necessarily, but rather would come up at the stage, the motion to dismiss stage, when the website says no, the Section 230 has a carve out here, and then a possible reply by the plaintiffs would be, well, no, FOSTA creates that exception. So it's not necessarily going to come up right at the start of a case. It has come up in a couple of civil cases that are not resolved, so we don't really know where that's going. Surprisingly, there were a number of civil cases filed against Backpage primarily, and also some other websites in state court before FOSTA was passed. And surprisingly and confusingly, for a while at least, they continued to file these cases in state court. That's confusing because, of course, FOSTA doesn't create any kind of carve out for civil litigants in state court. So it was kind of like they had this shiny new law and weren't using it. And indeed, I think they tried to argue in one case that it did apply in state court, and it plainly doesn't. The court dismissed that. Now the third addition was to federal criminal prosecutions under 2421A. I know of 2 indictments total that have been brought under 2421A. One, that count was dismissed. The guy simply used a website, and the court immediately acknowledged that there's no way in which he owned, managed, that sort of thing. And the other one is pending now. It's US v. Martono. The owner of a website called City X Guide has been charged under that provision, and that's pending. But that's all I know about I think especially the state AGs. A lot of rhetoric around this, a lot of energy around it, and really made it seem like, or argued prior to this law being passed, that without access to courts, that these websites would never be held accountable unless these AGs got to court, and the law passed and not a single one has used it, which really calls into question exactly how it would, in what way it could possibly be indispensable to trafficking prosecutions.
Well, and I'll just chime in. That all tracks with my knowledge of how FOSTA SESTA kind of hasn't really been used. It did not set off this kind of wave across the country of state AGs bringing cases against websites. But what it did do is put a lot of websites in a lot of fear that kind of prosecution was coming. And to me, the biggest legacy of FOSTA so far has been, it's been the horrible impact on sex workers and their ability to live and work safely. But that's been coming through the medium of the chilling effect that the law is having. And this is what is at the heart of the Woodhull Foundation and Human Rights Watch and EFF case, the First Amendment charge against the bill, saying that the expansion of federal criminal law to cover promotion and facilitation of prostitution is really vague, because a lot of those terms are not defined at federal level. But it meant that, when the bill was passed by Congress, before it had even been signed into law, we saw websites like Craigslist and Reddit shutting down entire forums. We've seen any number of reports of people either involved in sex work, the adult entertainment industry, or who are just posting kind of content involving sexuality or nudity, finding it a lot harder to even just have accounts on kind of mainstream social media sites, because there's this concern among website operators, among people who run social media sites or forums, let alone sites that actually specialized in providing information to sex workers, by sex workers, bad date lists, health and safety information, all different sorts of online resources. Everyone knows that there's this law out there that could be used against them in a way that it hadn't before. And that led to the response from a lot of websites to shut down forums, or to, for domain name operators to stop providing domain name services, just not wanting to be near this kind of content with a 10-foot pole.
I couldn't have imagined this. I don't think any of us could have imagined this, back when this law was being created and debated. But Section 230 and FOSTA-SESTA's implications on that have given a louder microphone to sex workers. And I think that is magnificent and interesting, especially considering, like, still in 2021, we're really struggling with this idea of how, I don't know how else to say it. Probably not going to be the correct way to say it, but like, a lot of people in society and, elected officials, there's not a lot of political capital in caring about sex workers. Let me say it like that. There's not a lot of political capital in caring about them. But because there's now so much buzz around Section 230 for a myriad of reasons, net neutrality, like blah, 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 these people have like a larger platform. And I think that is fantastic. But speaking of this louder microphone that they have, there's been a lot of reduction to legal businesses and legal behaviors, and think things like masseuses or people on dating sites. So I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit more about, in your respective states, what you've kind of seen amongst your colleagues or in your field about this enhancement of sex workers' voices. Has FOSTA-SESTA kind of inadvertently steered, given precedent towards caring about sex workers and what they do, and how FOSTA-SESTA has maybe inadvertently diminished the voices of people that are engaging in legal behavior? Actually, Emma, if you could start on this one, and then Danielle, if you have anything to say, and then. Okay.
Sure. Well, one reflection I can offer is that what we saw, one of the things that we saw in the wake of SESTA-FOSTA was last Congress, the introduction of a bill called the Safe Sex Worker Study Act, which was co-sponsored in the Senate by two, at the time, presidential candidates, Senators Sanders and Warren, and Senator Wyden, who was, one of the fathers of Section 230. So I don't know that, in the years prior to SESTA-FOSTA, we would have seen presidential contenders putting their names on a bill that were saying, like, actually, the safety of sex workers matters, and that this is an issue that matters to me at least as much as it matters to the people who might be voting to me. And that so very much to your point, Alexia, of the kind of elevating the profile of sex workers and the, kind of at the level of just general political discourse, and understanding that, when SESTA-FOSTA was going through committees and everything in 2017, 2018, we were not hearing from, advocates were hearing from sex workers and people working on behalf of sex workers, but Congress was not listening. And they were not inviting them to testify at hearings. And they were not, really willing to talk that much about what is going to happen to the people who are out there engaged in sex work. The focus was entirely on child sex trafficking, and then it kind of kept expanding, just like, okay, and then sex trafficking more generally, maybe we'll actually just talk about prostitution, which is switching changing the game entirely from a focus on the sex trafficking of minors. To me, just from somebody who's not deeply involved in the sex workers' rights advocacy world, it's just been a really palpable difference in how much more common it is to talk about the impact of this bill and, potential other amendments to Section 230, specifically from that lens of how it might affect sex workers.
Yeah, agreed. And I think we're seeing it in conversations now more than ever. And instead of just hearing from organizations that are anti-human trafficking in nature and as well as survivors, which I think is super important, we're also hearing from sex workers as well, which is equally important. I would say it's still pretty carceral in states. I think a lot of intentions are still, lock people away, charge them with misdemeanors or felonies. And that's not super helpful, even from a human trafficking standpoint. I can't, tell you how many survivors who have been arrested on prostitution charges and they, trying to restart their life can't because they have 13 misdemeanors and a couple of felonies. And who wants to hire someone with that record, even though they, are trying to change direction? And it's probably the same for sex workers too. And so it's challenging when you are trying to normalize things. And I may not be super clear here, but it's challenging when you are trying to normalize things, but you still have all these carceral impacts later down the road. So I think that's kind of a conversation for more decrim efforts and how that impacts sex workers too. But I don't want to muddy the waters with that conversation if we don't need to. So.
So yeah, I think that for sure it's brought the idea of sex workers' rights into kind of it's normalized that idea. And I think that one of the things that enabled FOSTA to pass so easily was the people's willingness to just assume that more sex work means more trafficking. And I think that one of the things that this has done is to really bring people into the conversation who are able to challenge that assumption, which is, I guess, an easy assumption to make if you're sort of outside the field. And that's really key, I think, to developing good policies, is to understand that no, criminalizing prostitution is absolutely not going to decrease trafficking. And likewise, raising barriers like through FOSTA to sex workers working is also not going to reduce trafficking. So I think that has been absolutely critical. And yeah, when the presidential candidates were co-sponsoring this bill, it was incredible. I mean, the sex workers I know and the allies were just, it's a very moving thing, I think, to see your cause move into the center, move to people who are just kind of going about their lives and haven't thought about it. And yeah, you're just another person who they can advocate for after centuries of stigma. So I think it's done good in that sense.
I love the way that this conversation is progressing, because again, you guys have led me into my next question. All three of you have said it. Alexandra, you put it into a really good, tweetable quote. Criminalizing prostitution does not reduce trafficking. I think that is a really good thing to start getting through people's heads. Given that we acknowledge this is true, how has this law, in you all's opinion, impacted our foreign pursuit of actual human trafficking? Like actually trying to stop this. And I'm kind of thinking about this from, an internet perspective, because if we had all these federal laws on the books, right? And then we created the SESTA-FOSTA law. But we also know, the internet is the internet. If you block it here, that's fine. I can very easily go to a UK website. I can go to a German website, and we can have the same type of conversations and facilitate the same type of transactions, no matter where the site is actually based at. So do you guys have anything, any anecdotal stories, any, kind of perspective on how this law has either helped or probably hindered our actual pursuit of human trafficking, because we're, this can just happen in foreign countries, and our access to intelligence, because, some of these things have been slowed down or blocked. Whoever wants to hop in.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I will go ahead with a very, very unsatisfying answer, which is we just have no clue. We can look at the theory that the predictions, which it stands to reason that now that websites have moved offshore, they're not going to be as easy to subpoena. They're not going to respond to subpoenas. Backpage, I think there was consensus even among its biggest detractors that it was very responsive to law enforcement requests. And when servers move offline, they're less accessible. So we have reason to believe that in theory, at least, it would hinder investigations. The truth is that data about human trafficking are virtually impossible to come by. So I don't, again, we can sort of theorize based on predictions and based on what we would expect from the standpoint of law enforcement and basic safety measures and all of that. But in terms of the actual numbers, we just don't know, and we don't have a way of finding out.
Yeah, I think that was kind of the bluntness that I was hoping for is that I really wanted to make that clear, and thank you, Alexandra, for making that clear, is that we don't know, we can't find it. And that is the critique, is that if you take people offline, you don't have access to intelligence, you don't have access to what's going on and where people are going and whatnot. And, given that open source information is is the largest, space that we can get data from. Handicapping ourselves in this way by taking this intelligence away from us is just, it's a problem. So thank you, Alexandra, for putting it exactly as bluntly as I was hoping one of y'all did. I also want to let the audience know that if you guys have any questions, please feel free to start dropping them in the chat. I meant to mention that earlier. I apologize, guys, but I hope that you all know that you can drop questions in the chat at any time. So I wanted to move on a bit to, maybe playing a different, kind of position on this. So for maybe you could think of people who have survived human trafficking. Maybe you could think of people who just kind of at their core really, are hyper against this, as everybody should be, but maybe very, very passionate, folks. We understand that this has silenced some people. We understand that it has silenced some legal voices, some legal professions. But, just to kind of play devil's advocate, is there any kind of merit to saying, well, yeah, we understand that, this has silenced some people, but it's worth it if we even have a slight chance of bringing in human traffickers, even if we have a slightly increased chance of bringing in, pimps and, all these types of people that we are trying to keep off of these streets. Like maybe it just hasn't been used yet. We should be happy that this is on the books because we have increased the prosecutorial landscape for this. Do you all see any kind of merit to such an argument? I've heard this from different people's videos and opinions on the law. And if you are kind of against this perspective, please tell us why.
Emma, I've been seeing your microphone go on and off, so I'll let you go first.
Oh, I had just a kind of offshoot point about international, kind of the impact on international sex workers, actually. So less about quite a little bit of a flip of your question, Alexia, of how have efforts to stop sex trafficking within the United States been impacted by a shift to activity happening on sites hosted overseas? We also saw kind of an inverse of that, where the activity of sex workers who used US-based services to conduct what was wholly lawful business in their countries or their jurisdictions also found their access to those services shut down. So I think the international law question is also a really important one, because it really brings into sharp relief the fact that sex work is treated differently under different laws all around the world. And what might be against the law in some jurisdictions, or even many jurisdictions in the United States, might actually be perfectly lawful in other places. The internet makes those kinds of boundaries and borders much harder to police. And so it was I think FOSTA also ended up being a really strong example of what does it mean for people around the world that so much US infrastructure, and particularly kind of websites and really popular websites, are housed in the United States. It means there's an outside impact that laws in the US can have on everyone's access to these services.
Emma, thank you so much for bringing that up. That is a really important point that I think that we need to touch on. And if we have some time, we can just like look down that rabbit hole. Just give it a see about how the importance of Section 230 does kind of end up impacting other countries' freedoms and their access to things. So I wanted to move on to my next question, but I want to address this. We have a couple of questions in the chat. So whoever wants to take this one up, please feel free. If there's someone asks, if there's a back page clone that is very bad, but not bad enough to attract DOJ investigation, and I'm kind of assuming that maybe they're saying that maybe a state, AG someone on a smaller level might be able to see it, but not, DOJ, then how do you stop them without something like FOSTA SESTA? Whoever wants to hop in or not, it's okay.
Well, if it falls under the definition of CSAM or child sexual exploitation already, there's already laws currently in place to prosecute on that. So I think it's just a matter of having clear enough definitions for these providers to go off of. And from there, you can take it to whatever direction you need to. Was that a fair answer, would you say?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, it depends on what is meant by is very bad, right? Like, there's a whole suite of potential behaviors that could fit under that, like CSAM, like other kind of obvious violations of federal criminal law. I think the big question, and something that maybe helps folks in the audience if they haven't spent a ton of time thinking about content moderation, one of the big questions when we're talking about the online content component of sex trafficking, a lot of times we're talking about advertisements and the idea that you're a site that hosts, that provides people the ability to post content that may be an ad, an offer to sell a used car or provide a service like a massage or engage in sex work. And the host of that content is not going to be able to review all of those posts before they get published. This is just sort of the nature of user-generated content hosting online. Services might use things like keyword filters or other kind of automation to try to scan content for either images that they've seen before that they know they want to block, possibly because they're CSAM, or to look for certain keywords to try to give them a sense of what might be happening in the ad and is it something illicit. I think it might have been Danielle who said before, like, people get wise to what's in your keyword filter pretty quickly and start using different vocabulary and terminology. So there's always something of a cat and mouse game going on there. And there's just no way to be absolutely certain as the host of user-generated content that there's nothing illegal getting posted on your service. So we have to get down to that level of detail when we're trying to think about what kinds of actions by a content host might actually be already covered under federal law as far as like intentional efforts to break the law, to violate things that are already crimes. And is there something that website operators are actually doing that should be illegal that isn't already covered by the law? And that's where I think folks like me get a little bit dubious that, there's a lot going on in the federal criminal code already. And what we seem to hear over and over again is lack of enforcement or under enforcement or under-resourced enforcement agencies who can't pursue cases that they'd like to, rather than the law itself not actually providing the right kind of prosecutorial tool.
I think FOSTA SESTA even prevents companies from exposing certain content because there is that liability as well. I know Facebook just did, I don't know if they just did it, but it was last year, I believe they did that 0-day exploit on that one, prolific predator who had over 24 accounts, was, sextorting, getting CSAM from over 200 minors, mostly female, some male. And so Facebook took it upon themselves to actually hire a third-party company to develop the 0-day exploit, and then was able to deliver the content to the FBI. But, without, like, I think more companies would be willing to do that if there wasn't certain policies in place like FOSTA SESTA that had, created that kind of weird gray ground of liability for them. So, but even then it was, they weren't acting as a government agent at that point, which I think FOSTA SESTA and other acts like Earn It and Save Act would do. They were acting on their own volition to take care of a problem that they were seeing that were affecting other content users.
So I love how, just the questions that are coming in the questions that I had for you guys, and y'all's answers. They're really kind of leading into each other. We have another question about, she's kind of questioning, what about the opportunities that FOSTA-SESTA provides for civil remedies for survivors and, potential monetary recovery. And you guys just talked about, lack of enforcement of current things on the books. What about these other acts? So I think it's definitely worth us discussing, or even giving like a very light overview of some of those laws that are on the book. So maybe some of the listeners can understand. So we could talk about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, the SAVE Act, a couple of you all mentioned. If someone is questioning, like if FOSTA-SESTA gives us this access, what other federal laws on the books do you all think are good enough to have already covered what FOSTA-SESTA is trying to do? And you guys don't have to just kind of stick to the laws that I just mentioned. You can, share whatever you think.
I'll start since I did litigation under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act for a while. So in 2000, Congress passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And then in 2003, it created a civil cause of action for any victim of human trafficking can bring their trafficker to court and recover damages. In subsequent reauthorizations, it expanded what that civil cause of action included. And that is the main law that trafficking victims can use to recover damages from their traffickers. And then what FOSTA did was that it created the carve out to Section 230, allowing that cause of action to be brought against intermediary websites. Now, a couple of things, I guess, in terms of what remedies already exist. First of all, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act civil cause of action, while intermediaries do have a Section 230 defense for material that is authored by third parties, if they participate in the content creation, they don't have any kind of Section 230 immunity. So cases that have eventually been dismissed under Section 230 brought under 1595, that's the civil cause of action under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, courts frequently said, look, the issue here is that they were acting as intermediaries here. They didn't create the content. But if they had created the content, that Section 230 wouldn't apply. So that is absolutely available in cases where the intermediary creates the content. Additionally, we've talked a lot about how federal prosecutions there's no exemption under Section 230. Cases brought under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act include mandatory restitution for victims. So that would be another avenue for recovery if the case is brought to federal court, criminal court. So those are all means of victims potentially accessing monetary damages.
I am so glad that we had that you were available to us, because it is very clear why we needed a lawyer to come on and make sure, specifically a internet human rights, human trafficking lawyer. Did anyone else want to hop on that before I moved on? I had a couple other questions, some that are coming in, a couple of them go along. Oh, okay, cool. So we are waiting on the GAO report. So technically, I think the GAO report is supposed to come out either yesterday or tomorrow, because the law said that 3 years after it is enacted, we should get a report. So a lot of these speculations that we're kind of thinking about of how effective it actually has been, who has used it, and blah, 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 that data should be available to us soon. So if any of our participants are interested in it, please kind of just keep abreast of what GAO is putting out. But it's going to give us a little bit more concreteness on some of the facts since this law has been enacted. But we have a question by one of the audience members, which I think is really, really fair. And I think we should, be able to talk about it a little bit. We have talked about this from the perspective of it not being advantageous to sex workers, and this law not actually reducing human trafficking. and us, kind of lowering our access to intelligence by driving these people underground and reducing the safety of other people that are reducing the safety or reducing the business and the commerce of people that are doing legal activity. But let's talk about, the impacts on Section 230 just a little bit, right? So we understand that there is a lot of hoopla around Section 30 for a ton of different reasons. And I'm wondering if by, starting or creating a law like Sesta Fosta that lightly tramples on Section 230 and kind of reduces speech. Do you guys think that this law, even though it has nothing to do, directly, its intent was about human trafficking, does it set a precedent on future laws and future bills against Section 230 changes and, discussions around free speech? Whoever would like to take that, please feel free.
I'm happy to chime in on that. I think we've definitely seen other proposals come up that are sort of in the model of FOSTA SESTA and how that changed 230. There are a lot of different ideas for how to amend Section 230 that have been introduced in last Congress and this one in particular. But the FOSTA SESTA model, I would say, is really that idea of making changes to federal criminal law and then making exemptions to Section 230 to cover things like civil claims or state attorneys general enforcement. Those are two different concepts that we're seeing come up in different ways, kind of with other subject matter, whether it's child sexual abuse material and bills like the Earn It Act, looking to really kind of change underlying criminal law, but also make changes to what liability services face for how they moderate content that might be CSAM. We're also seeing like wholly different ideas about how to amend Section 230 as well, things that are focused on, the way services use ranking and recommendation algorithms, or things that have, nothing to do with any particular content or criminal provision or violation of the law, but are looking at how they run their systems in general, and laws like the PACT Act. So I would say the short version is that the SESTA FOSTA model, I think, is one potential avenue Congress might go down for further amendments to 230. But it is really notable. FOSTA was the first time that Section 230 was amended since it was passed in 1996. And that's why I think I'm really interested to see what the GAO report is going to come up with. There was a really great report out from the Hacking Hustling group called Erased. I can drop a link to it in the chat, but it's their own report about what the impact of SESTA FOSTA has been kind of on sex workers in particular. And they did a variety of interviews, but also just on the kind of community and the online ecosystem in general. So to me, I feel like we're still very much in the evidence gathering phase of what has FOSTA SESTA meant, and would strongly urge Congress to learn from its first amendment to Section 230 before kind of going down that route and starting to create a lot of other changes to the federal criminal code or amendments to 230 directly.
Yeah, one of the audience members just kind of pointed out that, like, we do need to think more about bills that have unintended consequences. And every time we have action, there's an equal reaction, right? But like when we start making these, what seems to be incremental changes, and it seems to be very, very politically popular, like we have to, there is this impetus to get something politically popular through without really thinking about what the outcomes and what the consequences of it could be. Danielle, did you want to hop on? I'm not sure if I just saw your mic go in and out. It's okay if not.
No, I'm just agreeing with everyone. So I think, it's challenging because you do create policies and you try to get as much information to weigh the different effects and the cost involved in each of these different policies that get enacted. But at the end of the day, I think this is just another policy going through the policy process. And, the hope is that those with the power for policy making are going to listen to not just one or two stakeholders, but as many as possible to make informed decisions. So that's the hope and the goal at the end of the day.
Thank you so much, Danielle. So we only have a couple minutes left. This hour zoomed by faster than I thought it was, and we still haven't gone through all the questions. And I kind of want to end, I kind of want to end with this, highlighting, the fact that you all work in human trafficking. In different capacities. You all work, kind of in the sex trafficking space. You all work with, victims and prosecutors and people that are trying to make sure that their business models are able to exist, right, and continue to exist, whether it be sex workers or, whatever. Given how intimately familiar you all are with that space and the law, what would you say if you could, wave a magic wand, or you could tell Biden, the next president, the next Congress, hey guys, I understand what we're trying to do. We're trying to reduce human trafficking. I got it. I'm here with you. But this doesn't work. Here is what I will propose instead. If anyone, whoever, wants to go ahead and start us off, I'd love to hear from you all, because I think that, aside from giving a louder microphone to sex workers, the people that these kinds of things actually, impact, you all actually hear from survivors. You all hear from sex workers. You all hear from the people that we're trying to save. So, I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on how such a law or intent could be improved.
I'll go ahead. So the question of how we reduce trafficking, what's clear, what's so clear from, seeing, you can look at it by looking at data about prosecutions, you can look at it through, anecdotes that come up over and over, you can look at it through statistics about people seeking, survivor resources, all that. What's clear is that certain things put people at risk of being trafficked. Here, we're talking, I guess, about sex trafficking, and that those are things that we can address, and we cannot address them through the criminal justice system. That's simply not, that's just not the answer. These are things, predictably, like, very unstable home environments. People in foster care are, I believe I hesitate to use the word overrepresented, because that suggests a certain kind of statistical certainty, and we don't have that, but they're certainly represented among victims. These are people who are not protected at home. We don't have, despite, what you might see on TikTok or whatever, we simply don't have a problem in this country with people being kidnapped out of stable environments and trafficked. It doesn't happen. So the way to address the issue is really to address these risk factors, these root causes of trafficking. It has nothing to do with changing access to the internet. It has nothing to do with kind of, those are sort of end stage issues. So that's how I would address trafficking. Now, I also believe that decriminalizing sex work is certainly something that's going to make people's lives safer, and it's something that I advocate for. But I think it's important in this space to make clear that you don't have to believe in decriminalization to get on board with these other measures, like addressing these root causes, these underlying issues that make people vulnerable to trafficking.
And sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Alex. I was just going to add, I think prevention is huge. You have, if we can teach resiliency at a young age for vulnerable populations, and at the end of the day, everyone has a vulnerability that could be exploited, right? It's just a matter of tapping into that. And I've known survivors who come from affluent families and those who come from the foster care system. It could happen to anyone, because there are vulnerabilities that we all individually have to an extent. But I think as far as, kids and minors on different providers using the internet to reach out to their community, I think it just comes down to teaching them simple techniques that could help them, that could prevent them from falling into these type of traps that predators regularly lay for them. And it's not a matter of freaking them out and creating a society of Luddites from Gen Z, but it is about teaching them to trust but verify the source of information, the source of affection, the source of whatever it may be, and kind of, helping them to understand that stranger danger that exists within the realm of the internet community, not just as in a physical realm that they're used to seeing on a daily basis. So
Yeah, and as by far the least expert in how to actually stop trafficking on this panel, just a big +1 to Alexandra and Danielle's points. And from the online service providers' perspective, they need to have this say, the best advice to Congress or to the Biden administration thinking about this issue is talk to sex workers, talk to victims of trafficking, talk to people who actually know what resources they need access to, actually know the changes that would make what they consider an improvement to their lives possible. And online platforms should be doing the same thing. They should be understanding from the user perspective what was the kind of information that somebody wished they had had access to help them navigate a difficult situation. What are the online service providers getting wrong about how they're interpreting what they see people post and deciding you violated our terms, you're kicked off the platform, and that was actually somebody's lifeline, right? And to remember and to recognize that being able to communicate online, especially being able to communicate privately and securely online, can be an enormous benefit to people who are in so many different kinds of precarious circumstances or who are at risk in some way. And having policies, whether they're laws or just the effect of a law creating a widespread chilling effect across the online ecosystem, having policies in place that tell people who are already vulnerable that they're not welcome online and they're not going to have access to various services is the wrong way to go. So really try to think about it from the perspective of the people who are living their lives and have ideas about what would make their lives better, and let them be the drivers of the conversation.
I think she froze.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I heard you, but then I wasn't able to unmute myself, so I apologize. But we are at the end of our time, so thank God we didn't have any tech issues during. But there are a lot of things that we weren't able to hit on, like the outsized impact of tech firms in the censorship conversation. The outsized impact of US, and internet censorship. There's so many ways that we can kind of talk about this. And I'm just so grateful for all three of you all being able to come on and spend just a little bit of time with us. To any of our current listeners, our future listeners, all three of these amazing women have very, very good sources online about their work, their writings, their speeches on this topic. So if you are interested in learning more about these avenues that we didn't get a chance to go down yet regarding the FESTA-FOSTA law, or implications for internet companies, please check them out. I want to thank you all again and thank all of our attendees for joining us. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.